our keynote speaker, Dr. Sarah Hill. Now let me take.
Okay, I think this means you all can hear me. Yes. Okay. Oh, awesome. Okay, great. Okay, thank you so much for that that incredible introduction. I'm embarrassed. It was so nice. I'm over here blushing. So I'm going to go ahead and try to do my screen share. And we went through all of, wait a minute. Okay, so I was taught how to do this earlier this morning, and somebody was asking me about whether it's in Chrome, and I do have it in Chrome, but oh, there we go. I think I have it now. Okay, all right. All right, do you guys see my screen? Can somebody who I can hear let me? Okay, perfect. All right, amazing. All right, well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you everybody for being here. I was warned about the fact that I was just going to be looking at my slides, and I've been doing recently looking at the effects of hormonal contraceptives on women's psychology, their brains, and their behavior. And to start with, I'm just going to give you a little background on me, even though Joel did a very nice job of giving you a little bit of background. As Joel had mentioned, I went to UT Austin for my PhD, and I spent most of my career studying things like evolutionary psychology as it relates to things like the emotions, relationships, and then health-related behaviors. And I've always been really interested in studying these things from the perspective of women, just because a lot of the research that had been done during the time that I was a student, so back, in 2001, when I started my PhD program, a lot of it was geared at men's mating psychology and men's, sort of their evolved mechanisms. And so I was really interested in trying to look more at things from a woman's point of view. And so I've spent a lot of my career studying these things and looking at things like mate attraction and mate choice behaviors, and so on and so forth. And I had done a little bit of work looking at women's sex hormones across the cycle and how they relate to things like women's motivation to dress sexy or go shopping. I also published a paper on women's cycles and self-esteem, but it was never really my bread and butter. And I didn't really spend a whole lot of time thinking about the birth control pills specifically, really at all, until about 5 years ago. I don't know, I guess it's longer than that now. It's probably 8 years ago. And that's when I went off of birth control. And I really started thinking about the birth control pill because I had been on it for more than a decade of my life. And when I went off of it, I felt like I woke up. I started noticing men again. I started wanting sex in a way that I hadn't in while I was on the pill. I started cooking and exercising and downloading new music for the first time in years. And I just really felt like I was seeing the world in like three-dimensional sort of full color in a way that I hadn't experienced, and I didn't even know how long. Right. And so as I noticed these things in myself, I thought, that's curious. I sure do feel different now that I'm off of my birth control pills. But I sort of filed away that idea in the back of my mind and thought, well, this might just be one of those things that I experience, but other people don't experience, or, maybe it's the result of the fact that now I'm in my early 30s. And so maybe, something's going on with me that way. That's, the cause of this change in the way that I was experiencing life. And so I just sort of filed it away in the back of my mind and didn't pay too much attention to it. But then I went to flash forward about another year or two, and I was at the annual meeting for the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, or SPSP as we call it in the area. And I was at a talk at their Evolutionary Psychology pre-conference by my friend and all of your colleagues, Bruce Ellis. And this was a talk that he was giving on the effects of early life stress on the nature and functioning of the stress response in adulthood. And I was in this talk because a lot of my research at the time and still currently was looking at the effects of early life stress and how that plays out in influencing people's life history strategies and that sort of thing. And so I was in the talk, and Bruce was getting ready to talk about the results of this study that they had been conducting, looking at the effects of early life stress on the adult stress response. And as he was talking about the sample that they analyzed their data from, he mentioned this thing that you're seeing here highlighted in yellow. And he mentioned that although they had collected data on a large sample of both men and women, that they were only analyzing the data in their sample of men. And the reason for this was that the majority of women who were in their study were on hormonal birth control. And as Bruce noted, it turns out women who are on hormonal birth control don't experience a cortisol response to stress like every other healthy functioning adult does, right? So as you can see here, you can see this underlined, HPA axis reactivity measures in our girls using oral contraceptives were not valid in our sample. Indeed, these other people have shown that these girls do not show a cortisol response to social stress. And then he went on, and then he just talked about, what they found in men. And I don't even remember like what the results of that study were, right? I have no idea what the effects of early life stress and the adult stress response, because my brain was absolutely stuck on this point, right? And it was at this moment that I'd heard that, women who are on hormonal birth control don't experience a cortisol response to stress, which we'll talk about why this is a big deal in just a little while. But it was when I heard this little detail that my brain just started flooding with realization after realization that was actually pretty embarrassing for somebody who's been studying psychology for their whole career. But it was like, as soon as I heard this, I was thinking like, oh my gosh, the pill changes women's sex hormones. And hormones aren't just something that happens to our body, right? They're part of the way that our brain creates the experience of being who we are, right? They're part of our brain's signaling machinery. They're part of our body's signaling machinery. And hormones affect everything ranging from sex and attraction to hunger to energy levels, learning, memory, friendship, stress response, and everything else. So of course, the birth control pill changed me, right? The birth control pill changes everything. And it was at this moment, I left that research talk and I couldn't I couldn't stop thinking about this. Like, what else does the birth control pill do? Like, how embarrassing not to, when you're a psychologist, and especially I'd published papers about women's sex hormones and how they influence motivation and behavior. And the idea that it never occurred to me that the hormonal birth control that I was taking all of that time might be influencing my brain was a little bit embarrassing. But once I had the paradigm shift, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And so I went into the research literature and I downloaded every paper that I could find on PubMed and PsycInfo on oral contraceptives and psychology and the brain. And I read and I read and I read and I read. And once I got to the bottom of all of these different articles and saw all of the research that was out there, I was really shocked that the information wasn't out there in the public in any way. Like, I didn't know anything about the research that I had read after I discovered that, lo and behold, the birth control pill is changing our psychology. And so I wrote this book, available on Amazon or anywhere that books are sold. I wrote this book to provide all of this information to women. It's so that way when they're making choices about whether or not to use hormonal birth control, they understand the trade-offs that they're potentially making by making the choice to be on it. So today I'm excited to be able to tell you some of the big takeaways from the book, and also sort of talk about some misconceptions that I had about hormonal birth control that I had in part because I'm an evolutionary psychologist, and how some of those things ended up being a little bit different than what I was expecting. right? And so one of the first big takeaways and notes for readers of the book, and something for all of us to just sit and spend a moment really appreciating, is that we are absolutely biological creatures, right? And we are biological not only in terms of the evolutionary sort of big picture way, but also in the sort of nitty gritty, gears and sprockets, chemicals and electrical signals kind of ways, right? And the creation of being the human being that we are, right? All of our likes and dislikes and our personality and our preferences and our behavioral preferences and our feelings, right? All of those things are the result of chemical and electrical signaling that's going on in our body. And when it comes to the experience of creating like who we are and our brain's creation of the experience of who we are, one of the key pieces of information that the brain uses to create this are your hormones, right? And so your hormones are a key part of what makes you, you, right? And this is especially true when we're talking about our sex hormones, right? And of course, we were designed by the process of evolution by selection, right? Which is something that is powered by sex. So of course, our sex hormones play a really important role, right, in orchestrating and coordinating the activities of our brain and directing our behavior, right? And there's been decades of research in neuroendocrinology showing that our sex hormones are really instrumental in influencing a wide range of behaviors, ranging from things like sex, sexual desire, attraction, hunger, our eating behavior, emotion regulation, aggression, learning, memory, and so many more things, right? So our sex hormones are a really key part of what our brain uses to create who we are, right? And when we're talking about women's sex hormones, we're mostly talking about the two biggies, right? And the two big or primary female sex hormones are the hormones estrogen and progesterone, right? And we can see these mapped out in this little map here that my illustrator created to illustrate the changing hormone levels over the course of an ovulatory cycle, right? And just to start with, just to orient yourself to this figure, what you can see is that the ovulatory cycle or the menstrual cycle can generally be divided into two halves, right? The first half is the follicular phase, which is on days 0 to days about approximately 14. And you can see that the sex hormone estrogen, which is shown here with the dashed line, is the dominant sex hormone during that time, right? And it peaks right near ovulation when conception risk is highest, right? And of course, a lot of you probably are very familiar with a lot of the research on the effects of estradiol and ovulation on women's sexual psychology, right? And so all of that is, those sorts of estrogenic behavioral profiles and psychological profiles we tend to see in women during the follicular phase when estrogen is high. And then the women's other dominant sex hormone or other primary sex hormone is the sex hormone progesterone, which you can see shown here with the solid line. And this is the dominant sex hormone during the luteal phase of the cycle. So the luteal phase of the cycle is a part of the cycle after ovulation has occurred, and the empty egg follicle becomes a temporary endocrine structure called the corpus luteum. And its job is to release progesterone, which then helps to do things like stabilize the endometrium and get your body ready for pregnancy, right? And we can think about the cycle and women's hormones in terms of the jobs that have to be accomplished in order for pregnancy to occur, right? And so there's really two types of jobs that have to go on over the course of a cycle if a woman is going to get pregnant, right? And the first job that has to, or the first task that has to be accomplished for a pregnancy to occur is that a woman has to have sex, right? So this is something that's going to facilitate conception, right? And so we should expect to see that the sex hormone estrogen is associated with behaviors and psychological patterns that are consistent with sex and conception. And then the second task that has to be accomplished if a woman is to get pregnant is implantation, right? And this is where a fertilized egg or an embryo is able to successfully implant itself into the uterine lining and establish itself as a pregnancy, right? And so we can think about the sex hormone progesterone, which again, we're seeing over here in the solid line, as being associated with coordinating what I like to just call pregnancy things, right? So we can really think about the women's cycles as divided into these two halves, like one half that's associated with doing things related to sex and doing things related to conception, and all of that is coordinated by the sex hormone estrogen. And then we can think about the second half of the cycle, right, as being concerned with things related to implantation, right, or pregnancy things. And these are tasks that are coordinated by the sex hormone progesterone, right? And there's a lot of research now that's come out over the last several decades showing that these different sex hormones of women's, these two primary sex hormones, they are associated with a different psychological and behavioral profile. So we know from research that when estrogen is the dominant hormone, which again is something that tends to be the case during that follicular phase in the cycle, particularly right near ovulation. Research finds that sensory acuity increases, right? So women actually become more sensitive to their environment. And this is believed to be something that's a result of the increased sensitivity of women's neurons due to greater dendritic spine density that occurs during when estrogen is high. Estrogen actually works like fertilizer in the brain, and it causes dendritic spines to burst out of neurons in ways that make the brain more sensitive and change the sensory threshold. So women's sensory acuity increases, so they become more sensitive to things like smell. Their sexual desire increases. We know from research that estradiol is associated with increased attunement to men, so just general attention to men. Some research has found evidence that women exhibit a preference for cues associated with testosterone when estrogen is dominant. And we also see that women's energy levels tend to be relatively high and their appetites relatively reduced when estrogen is the dominant hormone, right? And all of these things make good evolutionary sense when we think about what's going on during the follicular phase of the cycle, and particularly during that periovulatory window. So right prior to and right near ovulation, which is a time during which sex can actually lead to conception. And when progesterone is dominant, we tend to see a different sort of psychological and behavioral profile of women, right? So this hormone is associated with women feeling sleepier, right? We know that it's associated with reductions in sexual desire, right? So it's not just that estrogen sort of fuels women's sexual response. Progesterone is actually sexually inhibitory, right? And this is actually why some women experience an increase in sexual desire right when they get their period, because progesterone levels plummet. And then women are like, oh my God, I feel like a new woman, right? Like I'm throwing off the chains because the progesterone is gone away and it is sexually inhibitory. You also see progesterones associated with increased appetite. So women eat more during the progestogenic phase in their cycle, so during the luteal phase of the cycle. And this is in part, of course, to make sure that a woman is maintaining enough calories in her body to be able to promote implantation into pregnancy, but also because women's body temperature increases when progesterone is the dominant hormone, and this is something that increases women's energetic needs during this time. You also see a reduced preference for testosterone cues, and women generally feel more calm and relaxed when progesterone is the dominant hormone relative to estrogen. The exception to this last point is women who suffer from severe PMS or PMDD. In that case, progesterone is actually associated with the opposite set of patterns, which I won't have time to talk about today, but I'm happy to discuss later if any of you have questions. So the birth control pill, of course, when we're looking at this little, this figure, again, looking at the dynamic changes in women's levels of estradiol and progesterone over the cycle, right? And we talked about the fact that women's psychology and their behavior tends to shift over the course of the cycle in response to whichever of those hormones is dominant at that time. The birth control pill, because it's going to change all of this, of course, it's probably going to be associated with psychological changes. And that's what the pill does. So the pill actually inhibits the activities of women's HPG axis, or hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, and it suppresses the release of FSH and LH, which then inhibits the ovarian production of egg follicles, which then inhibits estradiol production, which inhibits progesterone production. So the birth control pill inhibits the release of estrogen and progesterone by replacing them with a daily dose of a synthetic set of hormones, right? And so this is, just to orient you to this figure, this is an example of what a woman's quote unquote cycle looks like when she is on the birth control pill. So this is a combination birth control pill that it contains synthetic estrogen, ethinyl estradiol, and in this case, the synthetic progesterone, which is known as a progestin, levonorgestrel. And as you can see here, rather than experiencing this dynamic shift of being estrogen dominant during the first half of the cycle and then progesterone dominant during the second half of the cycle, when women are on hormonal contraceptives, they're actually getting the same hormonal message every day, right? And you can see from this figure, the hormonal message that women's brains are getting when they're on hormonal birth control is one that is high synthetic progesterone, or high levels of progestins, and then relatively low levels of estradiol, right? So every day looks a little bit like a synthetic version of the luteal phase, right? Because we have the progestin being the dominant hormone and estradiol being relatively low. And this has led, a lot, especially of evolutionary thinkers, because we're big picture thinkers, right? Neuroscientists tend to look at nanoparticles and little phalanges and cogs. As evolutionary psychologists, we always look at the big picture. And so a really, smart general hypothesis to make when you look at something like this, and then you think about women's, cycles that naturally occur and what job progesterone is sort of designed to help do, a prediction that we might make just looking at this pattern of data here is, well, women on hormonal birth control must sort of just experience the world as somebody who's chronically stuck in the luteal phase, right? But it turns out that these messengers, these chemical messengers in these synthetic hormones, isn't quite the same as our actual endogenous hormones. And in particular, the synthetic progesterone, or these progestins, that hormonal message is not read by the brain or the rest of the body as being actually just like progesterone, because most of these synthetic progestins are actually synthesized out of testosterone, and they just move around a few molecules to make them stimulate progesterone receptors to the degree that they will suppress the HPG axis. But it turns out that they bind to all sorts of other stuff too, right? So they bind to things like testosterone receptors, they bind to glucocorticoid receptors, they bind to all sorts of stuff. So on the one hand, as evolutionary thinkers, we can make the prediction that women who are on the pill should look more like luteal phase women than follicular phase or ovulatory women, right? And as you'll see, some of the data are very supportive of that, but they don't look exactly the same. And the reason for this is that the hormonal message that women's bodies are receiving from these pills isn't the same thing. And that was something that I didn't really appreciate until I really dug into the literature. Because when I started writing this book, because of course, I'm an evolutionary psychologist, and when I was first digging into the papers, my expectation was that it was going to look a lot like pill takers were just like chronically, luteal. But and then when I got into it and saw how messy these compounds are and how sort of non-specific they are in their binding within cells, that I really started to appreciate why we get such sort of weird patterns of results in pill takers when we compare them to natural cyclers, even those in the luteal phase, right? So because we change women's hormones with hormonal birth control, this of course means that the birth control pill is going to change women, right? Women's brains are influenced by sex hormones. We change women's sex hormones, duh, it's going to influence the brain. It's going to change what women do. And now I'll just talk a little bit about what some of the data show. So to start with, there's been a great deal of research over the past, 20 or so years showing that birth control pill use is associated with changes in sexual desire, right? So many women experience diminished libido on hormonal contraceptives. And so research has found this both with respect to libido and sexual desire, but also sexual functioning. So women who are on hormonal birth control can also, in addition to not feeling like they want sex as much, they also can have problems with their sexual response. So having issues with things like lubrication. Women have reported clitoral shrinkage, particularly with the hormonal IUD, and also issues with orgasms. And the reason for this is, of course, the hormones that facilitate sex in women are testosterone and estrogen, right? So testosterone, just like it does in men, is associated with sexual desire and sexual functioning for women. Estrogen, as we know, is associated with sexual functioning and sexual desire in women. And we know that progesterone is sexually inhibitory, right? And when you look at the hormonal profile of women who are on hormonal birth control, it's basically like sexual anti-venom, right? So you get low levels of testosterone, and we'll talk a little bit about this in just a moment. But essentially, women who are on hormonal birth control just release just tons of sex hormone binding globulin, and it just mops up all of their free testosterone and makes their levels of free testosterone more than 60% lower than that of natural cyclers. So it kind of goes into the toilet. We know that estrogen is kept low because, of course, ovulation is being suppressed. And the dominant hormone in hormonal birth control are these synthetic progestins, right? So women are actually having a hormonal cocktail that's totally antithetical to sexual desire. And lo and behold, many women experience sexual side effects on hormonal birth control. Right. And there's also research evidence that suggests that the birth control pill may influence women's partner preferences. And I say may because there's still a lot of hot debate in the literature about this. And this is something that I acknowledge in the book. But I think that it's important for women to understand that this is something that is within the realm of possibility, right? This isn't to say this is necessarily going to happen. And this is true of all of this research, by the way, because one thing that this research literature also really made me appreciate is how idiosyncratic women are in their responses to hormonal birth control, because some women will have this type of response, right? And other women will have that type of response. And it's just really hard to predict who's going to respond what way to what thing. But there is some literature that tends to suggest, excuse me, that hormonal birth control is associated with changes in partner preferences. And this research is actually grounded in some research that you all are probably very familiar with. And this is research that finds a link between women's levels of estradiol and then the testosterone preference that they have in men, right? So what this research finds, this is actually an artist's rendition of the Roney and Simmons paper, where they tracked women's levels of estradiol over the course of 2 cycles. And they tracked that on the testosterone preferences in the faces of men. And what they found was this beautiful overlapping pattern, which, since we're all scientists in this room, you all can appreciate how rare it is to find data points that overlap to the degree that estradiol and women's preference for testosterone does in this study. But what they find, and what other researchers have found, is that women's levels of estrogen tend to predict their preference for testosterone in men. And then, of course, this leads to the prediction that if you suppress women's estrogen levels, like you do on hormonal birth control, that you may inhibit women's preference for testosterone preferences, therefore leading women to prefer a less masculine male face in a partner, right? And there has been some research that is consistent with this hypothesis, right? So research has found evidence that women prefer less masculine male faces, both for dates and mates. So in other words, for long-term and short-term partners, right? And what you can see here are 2 faces that were sort of, it's like an average face created. I'm using one of those sliding scales. Women are asked to make the most desirable male face for a partner. And what they tested women twice. They tested them once while they were naturally cycling. They didn't specify where in the cycle they were though. And once when after they had started hormonal contraceptives, so these were the same women, and so one time when they're naturally cycling, and then once 3 months after they had started taking hormonal birth control. And what you can see is that the face on the right has more cues to facial masculinity, and this is the average face created by women who are naturally cycling, than the face on the left, which was the average face created when these same women were on hormonal birth control, right? And as you're probably noting, right, these two faces aren't like hugely different from one another, right? It's not like, wow, like that's crazy. But instead, these are likely subtle differences, right, that cue testosterone presence that women are probably picking up on when they're at high fertility, and not picking up on when they're at low fertility, right? So when we think about some of these differences that we see in things like sensory acuity, when women have high levels of estrogen, you know, that's a potential mechanism that could explain why we get these subtle differences. There's also been studies comparing the faces of photographs taken of men that were chosen as partners by women who were naturally cycling or women who were on hormonal birth control when they chose their partners. And then they've looked at ratings, so subjective ratings, and then also objective measurements of cues associated with facial masculinity. That study found the same thing, where women who choose their partners while they're on hormonal birth control may be choosing partners with less masculine male faces than what is chosen by women who are naturally cycling. But again, you know, we need more data on these types of patterns before we can draw any sort of firm conclusions. But this is one possibility about the effects of hormonal birth control on women's mating and sexual psychology. Other factors, other things that have been widely reported in the literature, we find that hormonal contraceptives are associated with a lot of mood-related side effects, right? So more than half of women who start hormonal birth control stop within the first 6 months, right? And if you think about that, that's a huge I don't know if the word is compliance, or non-continuity, or like lack of continuity, right? Like if we had a freshman retention of only 50%, the universities would all be freaking out, right? So about half of women discontinue hormonal birth control within the first 6 months that they're taking it. And the number one reason that women discontinue is because of side effects, right? And more than half of these women who discontinue hormonal birth control because of side effects do so because of changes in mood. Right, so mood-related side effects are very common on hormonal birth control. And in one particular study that did a really nice job of looking at just how much being on hormonal birth control increases the risk of experiencing mental health side effects, I'll tell you about a really wonderful study that was done in 207 in 2018 by a group of Danish researchers, where they used the Danish health registries to look at to what degree does a woman's risk of being diagnosed with depression increase if she's first been prescribed hormonal birth control. And the way that they were able to answer this research question is by looking at the health records of all the women in Denmark, right, between the ages of 15 and 35, right? Every single woman in Denmark, they took all their health records and then they divided them into two piles, right? Women who were prescribed hormonal birth control during period of time X, and then women who were not prescribed hormonal birth control time X. And then they looked at subsequent diagnoses of depression and then subsequent prescriptions for antidepressants, right? And what we're looking at here is just a tiny snapshot of some of the data from this particular study. And what you can see here is that for women who are on hormonal birth control, right, and we'll start with this column here in the middle that says all women. What this is telling us is what is the percent increased increased risk of being diagnosed with depression if you are on if you were first prescribed hormonal birth control compared to what it would be if you were not prescribed hormonal birth control. And what you can see is that for the birth control patch, being on the birth control patch is associated with a 90% increase in the risk of being diagnosed with depression. Vaginal ring, 50%, right? We go down to a birth control pill, a combination birth control pill that contains the progestin desogestrel, and you get a 220% increased risk of being subsequently diagnosed with depression compared to women who are never prescribed or not prescribed hormonal birth control, right? So you can see that when we're talking about all women, this is looking at all the women ages 15 to 35, you get a pretty substantial increase in the risk of being diagnosed with depression if you've been prescribed hormonal birth control, right? When they isolate the analysis to only look at adolescent women, so these are women ages 15 to 19 in their sample, women whose brains are still developing, what you see is that the increase of depression risk is substantially greater for these women. So for example, if you look at the patch, which for all women is associated with a 90% increased risk of being diagnosed with depression, when we're talking about these very young women whose brains are still developing, it's associated with 180% increased risk in developing depression, right? And this is something that's very important to note, particularly for parents of daughters. A lot of times doctors get a little bit hot to trot to prescribe hormonal birth control to adolescent girls for things like acne or irregular menstrual cycles. And looking at these data, I hope that at least makes parents aware that this is something that's a possibility, so that way they can keep an eye on their children, right? I don't necessarily think it's a great idea to be going on hormonal birth control for non-serious reasons. In other words, pregnancy prevention while girls' brains are still developing. But we can talk a little bit more about that in the discussion section. More bad news. There's also been research now looking at the relationship between the use of hormonal birth control and suicide risk. And what this research finds is that you get a substantial, the risk of dying by suicide increases 3 times, it's like 300% higher among those who have been prescribed hormonal birth control compared to those who have not. And again, in this study, what they found was that it was the adolescents, these young women, 15 to 19, who are most at risk. And other research now has found that being on hormonal birth control during adolescence, so again, during that period of time when your brain is still developing, and generally in the research literature, they refer to the adolescent period. It's usually between 15 to 19 in the samples that they study. What they find is that women who were prescribed and used hormonal birth control during this period, that is associated with a greater risk of developing major depressive disorder at any point in their life subsequent, even after they discontinue hormonal birth control, right? And what this is suggesting to us, of course, is that the using hormonal birth control while your brain is still developing may be associated with organizational changes at the level of the brain that may increase a woman's risk of psychological problems throughout her lifetime. And again, this is something that I think is really important for parents to know, because OB-GYNs and pediatricians oftentimes are the ones who are prescribing these to girls, that they're not really, they don't have their foot in neuroscience literature. And so this is something important for parents to know, just as they're thinking about making decisions or helping their children make decisions about their physical and mental health. What are the reasons for this? Most of the research tends to focus on the association between pill use and the neurotransmitter activity, in particular GABAergic activity. So GABA, of course, is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It's the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain, and inhibitory neurotransmitters slow down the brain, right? They tend to be calming. They kumbaya us, right? So GABA is what gets released when we do things like meditate. When we drink alcohol, that stimulates GABA receptors, and that's what relaxes us. Right, so GABA is something that tends to be very calming, and there's a lot of research that indicates that lack of GABAergic activity is associated with things like mental health disorders, including anxiety and depression. And one potent activator of GABAergic activity in women's brains is the sex hormone progesterone. And when progesterone is being broken down and metabolized, it releases a neurosteroid called allopregnanolone. That's a potent stimulator of GABA activity in the brain. And so what research finds is that, lo and behold, women who are on hormonal birth control, because they're not releasing progesterone, instead they're getting this daily dose of these synthetic progestins, which aren't even made out of progesterone. That doesn't, when it's being metabolized in the body, get broken down into allopregnanolone. And so women who are on the pill have substantially lower levels of allopregnanolone, and this is believed to potentially, cause depression or be related to depression, because it's essentially leading to a reduction in GABAergic activity in the brain, making the brain having a harder time calming itself down. And when the brain can't calm itself down, this of course can lead to anxiety and depression. Right. Also, some of the changes in the stress response are also believed to be playing a role in the increased risk of depression and anxiety in women that we see on the pill. Right. And this is to circle back to that story that sort of first brought me into the world of the effects of hormonal contraceptives on women's brains. And that is this weird thing where women who are on hormonal birth control don't experience a cortisol response to stress. Right. And just again, to give you sort of a little bit of a background on all of this, stress is something we've all experienced, right? Whether it's just sitting in traffic or giving a speech or being on the business end of a wildebeest stampede. Stress, when we're experiencing it, no matter what it is that causes it, within about 5 minutes of experiencing something stressful, our body will release the stress hormone cortisol, which does things like dump fat and sugar into our bloodstream so we can make a quick getaway. It causes the birth of new neurons in the hippocampus, leading our brain to be able to learn and remember things from the stressful situation. So cortisol, even though we tend to think of it as a bad guy, just because when you have too much of it, it is a bad thing. It's something that is part of the way that the body actually copes with stress and learns from stress. And what research shows, and has been showing since the 90s, by the way, is that women who are on hormonal birth control, they don't experience a cortisol response to stress. So what you can see here is on the left-hand side, you can see cortisol levels in response to a stressor of naturally cycling women on the left-hand side. And this is just what every other healthy functioning adult stress response generally looks like in response to something stressful. And you can see the pill takers on the right-hand side, and they're absolutely flatlined. And I don't have time to get into the ins and outs of all of this, but what the research seems to indicate is that when women are on hormonal birth control, their HPA axis or their cortisol sort of axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is what sort of prompts the release of cortisol, is that when you first go on the birth control pill, that it actually causes the HPA axis to go into absolute overdrive, and that the body just starts trying to turn off the stress response because it's being too stimulated. And that this blunted stress response that we see in women who are on hormonal birth control is actually the result of the fact that their body has shut down their stress response because it was being overly activated. And the sort of leading theory about why this goes on, again, has to do with this lack of binding specificity of these progestins, and that they're probably stimulating women's cortisol receptors to hell and back, leading women to shut down their stress response and leading to patterns like this. And this is something that's not good, right? Even though we might think that women should then therefore experience less stress, this isn't actually what happens. When you don't have stress hormones, that doesn't mean that you don't experience stress. It means you don't cope with stress. Right? It means that your body's ability to cope with stress is being compromised, right? And this is something that potentially can lead to mental health problems. And indeed, this is the exact pattern of hormones that we see in people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, right? And so this isn't something that people want to have. Right. And this isn't where it ends, of course, because women live in an interconnected web of other people. Right. So women don't live in a vacuum. Women live in a world in which they're connected to their friends and to their family and to their romantic partners and to their colleagues. And so when we change individual women by changing their hormones with hormonal birth control, it's going to change the way that women interact with all the other people in their life. Right. And this, of course, is going to change what everybody else does. Right. And we've already seen this with things like college admissions rates. Right. Women are going to college at greater rates than ever before because of birth control in part, right? We're able to do that because we don't have to worry about getting benched due to an unexpected pregnancy. So we're setting longer term goals and we're achieving them, right? So by changing the world, or by changing women's hormones, in addition to changing women and changing what women's brains are doing, we're also changing the world. So in summary, the whole point of my book is about just really starting more conversations about hormonal birth control. Given that hormones are a part of what our brain uses to create who we are, when we change those, of course, that's going to change women and it's going to change the world, right? And we need to know, we don't know enough with the specific research that's out there. Like we've only scratched the surface in understanding all of the different ways that hormonal birth control changes women's brains, right? So we don't know all of the ways that it changes women's brains, but we do know that it does, right? And this doesn't mean that we need to abandon hormonal birth control, right? I absolutely don't think so. Pregnancy prevention and being able to plan, which is something you can't do without effective birth control. This is like the single most powerful tool that women have in terms of their own economic and political advancement. So I don't think that we need to be abandoning the birth control pill. We do need more options though. And we also need to be giving this information to women so that way they can understand what the different range of potential side effects are. So that way they can make informed decisions and actually have informed consent when they're choosing to take this product. So that is that. This here is showing you the different versions of my book. This is a total flex move, as my daughter would say. But that's my website, and you can find me on social media. I'm very active on Instagram. I use that as a platform for educating women about sex and hormones. So you can find me at Sarah E. Hill, PhD. And I'm going to escape out of here so that way I can see your faces. And I don't know if I stopped screen sharing or not, but yeah, I don't know how to do questions. Like I don't know what we're supposed to do now. Yeah, the end. I'm so excited to go to the Neeps pub.
Am I there at the microphone?
I can hear you.
Okay, this is my first time getting it right, so so thank you so much, and I feel very validated because I remember being in my 20s and trying the pill and being told I was imagining things or whatever. And now that I am post-menopausal, I'm curious if you have an opinion about like different, if you have knowledge or opinions about that, things like estradiol. And by the way, I'm now going through this with statins. I keep taking a statin, getting horrendously depressed, and the doctors tell me, no, this has nothing to do with it. So this is, I just feel like everyone in this auditorium, no matter how old you are, if something's not right, it doesn't mean it's the pill or whatever it is that you're taking, but it means something's not right. And doctors have no business telling you it's not right.
Yeah, no, and that's like been a big, thing that a lot of women have experienced, right? In fact, in the Instagram world, because there's a lot of people who are very vocal about this, right? It's like they call it medical gaslighting, and nobody gets medical gaslighted more than women, and especially with drugs, because they don't test them on us. and our side effects are always different. And so doctors will say, we have no evidence of that. And then it's like, no shit, Sherlock, you didn't test it, you know? And so they find that it's 80, when you hear this stat, you're going to die. 80% of new drugs that go to market get taken off the market within the first year because of unintended side effects in women. And the reason that these unintended side effects in women are occurring is because they're not testing in us. And there's this whole thing in the medical field where they still believe in this Cartesian split, where the mind and the body are two separate things. And so anything that you're experiencing psychologically, they're not going to acknowledge. But I can tell you that, like, when you change anything that's going on in the body is such a messy mess of spaghetti because it was not built by an engineer, and doctors haven't figured that out yet. And so when you have something that you're taking, like a statin, it is not localized. It's going to affect every cell that picks up on whatever it is that's in them. And I'm guessing that some of those are in the brain. And so, you know, and we find this with, I was talking to this journalist recently, and she was writing an article about this. We find this with antihistamines. Some people get these like crazy psychological side effects from antihistamines. I mean, there's all kinds of, in the mechanisms for this are all very well understood. Like, we know that inflammation and inflammatory activity influences mood and sociality and all these other things. And the idea that you can take something that's going to change your levels of inflammation in one way or the other, and it's not going to influence you psychologically, is just crazy. And it's inconsistent with lots of research. And so, yeah, anyway, I absolutely agree. If you're at the doctor and it doesn't feel right and they say, we don't have any evidence of this, and you can say, well, did they actually test for it? Because that's really, I mean, it's like, you're not going to have evidence for something you didn't test. And
the test.
yeah, well, yeah. And in terms of the hormones, you know, the hormone replacement and that sort of thing, you know, all of that, like the sort of bioidenticals or body identical hormones, they can like be very helpful in terms of relieving people's psychological and physical symptoms that they have with the menopausal transition. And I would just make sure that if you're going to be using those, that you use the body identical ones and don't let them put you on a progestin, because that's just going to make you feel worse. And some doctors will try to prescribe that, but you're going to want to use like an actual like progesterone cream, or, you know, something like that. But I you know, based on the research, like, we know what hormones do. We know how, you know, estradiol influences the brain and how we feel. And we know progesterone influences the body and how we feel. And if you want to prolong the magic in terms of keeping those hormones relatively elevated, while, you know, for a little bit longer than what you would like when you actually do transition in menopause, I say go for it. You know, there's no, just because that's like not, you know, natural, like death is natural, like having gray hair when you're 40 is natural. And there are things that we can do that, you know, where you can kind of prolong the magic a little bit and not have it be something that ends up being disadvantageous from the body. And there's a lot of research that seems to indicate that, especially estradiol treatment, as women are transitioning into menopause, it really can be associated with positive changes in their mood and their sort of joie de vivre.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'll let somebody else.
Yeah, and sorry, I kind of went off on a soapbox, y'all.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Debbie.
Awesome talk.
Thank
I'm
you.
like so shocked about the cortisol finding. So, are there any, do you know of any studies, or is your lab working on anything where that HPA axis can be built back up when women get off the pill, or is it like once it's gone for good?
You know, that's like a really great question. And so I have seen research looking at, because one of the other sort of binding globulins, like, because the sort of believed mechanism by which women's HPA axes are shutting itself down is the release of these glucocorticoid binding globulins, or CGBs. And there's research showing that, because the other binding globulin that women release a lot of on the pill is sex hormone, and that keeps their testosterone low. And there's research showing that women who have discontinued the pill continue to have elevated levels of sex hormone binding globulin, kind of like into perpetuity, which is really sad and horrible. And I'm guessing that we would find a similar pattern with CORT, Like I'm guessing that women's, that their levels, but nobody's done that study yet. I'm hoping to see that. Like we're doing right now some stuff. We're not looking at people who've discontinued the pill and how to sort of like whether there's some sort of a therapy for that, which I love your idea for that though, of like coming up with, is there a therapy that we can, like, how can we nurture sort of destruction or like diminished release of these binding globulins? Like what are things that we can do to try to minimize that? Like I love that as a research question. We're doing some research right now, which is being led by Summer Mengelcook, who's here, and also looking for postdocs if anybody knows anything really cool. She's doing some stuff looking at how this dysregulation in the cortisol response might actually change women's inflammatory response to stress too, because cort regulates inflammatory activity. And we know from research that women who are on the pill have a greater risk of autoimmunity. And so we're really interested in how that might be playing out. But no, I really like the idea about sort of what can we do after the fact? And I don't have a great answer to that, but I'm hoping that you might do that research, Jimmy.
Thanks.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for a really great talk. As the daughter or father of a daughter who's 18, it was really interesting. I'll forward her the information. I won't have that talk. But what really strikes me is, you mentioned how critical birth control is for giving women agency and allowing them a lot of control over what they have. And it's reminiscent of the general problem that we see in a lot of Western societies with declining birth rates, because women are being faced with the dilemma of rock and a hard place, children, career, and making that balance. This seems to be another one of those kinds of rock and a hard place burdens that we're putting on 50% of the population. So what kinds of things can we do to try and either encourage the right kind of research or encourage the right kind of policies so that we give women as many positive options forward rather than making them have to choose between, avoiding pregnancy or depression when you're 18, 19 years old? Thanks.
Right. No, I think that that's a really great question. And, I think that there's two answers to that, right? I think that one answer is that we need to be putting pressure on the drug companies to be innovating in this space of contraception. Because usually with any sort of prescription drug that's out there, about 20% of revenues get invested back into research for R&D for the creation of new drugs. With contraception, the amount of revenues that gets invested into R&D is 2%. It's like nothing. So nobody is looking at this. Now, thankfully, there's a lot of sort of movers and shakers in the femtech world that are trying to shake this up a bit. So they're saying, look, healthcare is not going to do shit for us. And so we're going to have to do this ourselves. And so they're working on starting companies trying to either develop new forms of birth control for women, or to help better match women to forms of hormonal birth control that are going to be like the least worst option for them. And so I'm really excited to see those things. So one is putting pressure on the drug companies. The other thing is just putting, we need to really put pressure on the powers that be in things like the NIH and in research journals. And, in our fields, of course, when we're studying the softer sciences and like behavior, and we are able to study on undergraduates, like a lot of that research is done on women because that's who our students are and it makes it really easy for us. But when we get to the biomedical related types of research and health research and preclinical research in neuroscience, where we're trying to understand the brain and how all of that works, there is still a lot of, NIH says that they won't fund research that doesn't include females, but people can define that however they want to. So most of that research is done mostly on men or mostly on male animals. And it's done that way because it's easier and cheaper. And we need to really put pressure on, things like the NIH, publishing houses like Science and Nature and the other journals that, neuroscience, these other journals, Nature Neuroscience, that publish these papers, to not allow them to be published unless they not only include some females, but are publishing on an equal number of males and females. Because as soon as you make it not worse to do research on females, more people are going to study females and women's issues. Like, I think that people sort of steer away from women's issues because it's like, if your colleague is studying male issues, they're going to be publishing 15 times the papers that you are, right? Because they're able to do it more quickly because they don't have to account for cycle and all of these other things that people generally have to account for when they're doing biomedical or health related research on females. And so I think we have to change the science establishment to make it more friendly and make it easier to win as a researcher who's studying women. And then we also need to be putting pressure on the drug companies.
Thanks. It's a great answer. I'm review some of those articles, so I'm definitely going to pay more attention to that. Thank you.
Yeah. Yay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sarah, that was an outstanding talk. I feel privileged actually to have been here. I feel like it was so broadly educational. And just quickly want to say, Tony, that was a great Led Zeppelin shirt, by the way. I did notice that. Pretty impressive. But Sarah, I just want to say, the thing I'm going to talk about tomorrow is largely about evolutionary mismatch. And I almost feel like this is, in so many ways, the most dramatic, or one of the most dramatic examples of evolutionary mismatch, where the scientific community that has created these has almost completely been devoid of thinking from an evolutionary perspective whatsoever. And I think that it's almost like you're like totally exposing that. And once you see it from an evolutionary perspective, it's like, oh my God, it's so much like turning on the light in the basement or something like that. I think it's so profound. So thank you for doing such a great job of integrating this all together and sharing it with us. So I guess I just want to ask a sort of a big question, which is, I love how you talk about how it's changing women, it's changing the world. What are some sort of large-scale things? You talked about college ratios of men to women as one example. What are some other large-scale things that you see that have unwittingly come about by all this?
Yeah, no, this is such a great question. So, and this is like a little bit of a hypothesis, okay? So, and we have some evidence that suggests that, it's supported by some data. There's one study in our lab, and so it never got followed up on. But I think that the male-female achievement gap in part has to do with birth control pill. And so, there's on the one side of it, there's the obvious part, which is like, oh, okay, women don't have to worry about getting pregnant. And so we're setting longer term goals and we're doing better in school and we're going to college and whatever. But that's not the only thing that's happening with the achievement gap, the male to female achievement gap. The other thing that's happening is that men aren't really doing a whole lot. They're falling behind. And as a mother, I've got one of my children is a son. I really worry about this because boys are not doing well. And there's a number of different factors at play. But I think that one of those factors at play is that men don't have to achieve like they used to in order to get laid. And so because women are now more sexually unrestricted because we can be, just like men have been for years, because we have hormonal birth control and we are able to, be all but completely certain that our partners are, we're not going to be getting pregnant. It's allowing women to become a little bit more flexible in their partner choice, right? So so you can choose Mr. Good Genes and you don't have to worry about him having, it's just like he just is like juicing the mechanisms in your brain that are used to picking up on the testosterone cues or whatever, but you don't need to worry about picking up on any of those cues associated with long-term investment and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole lot of guys out there who are achieving less than they ever have before, who are still able to get partners because they don't actually have to have accomplished a whole lot. And I think that this can be sexually, or this can be demotivating. And so like we did a study, for example, where we randomly assigned guys to read one of two articles. One was essentially that like women's standards for sexual partners are, way high. And then in one, it was like women's standards for sexual partners are way low. And then we had them do the grit scale. And look at self-control, and they did worse when we told them that women didn't require, when women's standards were low, and that's like our one piece of evidence. But I can't help but think that one piece of sort of this, and there's video games and porn. I mean, there's so much to this, male female achievement gap. But I can't help but think that and even just women's changes in sexual behavior are another one of these like big sorts of structural changes that we've seen, and the workplace is changing, and it's because women are in the workplace and so on and so forth. So.
Yeah, so this is super interesting answers. One final additional comment to sort of add is that this idea of the gap between male and female achievement. I also have a son and a daughter, and I think a lot of people in that situation sort of see it and understand it. But it's probably one of the most politically incorrect things that you're even allowed to talk about, let alone study. There's Google email and this kind of thing, and it's like you step back for just like 1 second. What you're saying is it's veridical, it's real, it's obvious, and it's. I feel like changing the culture so we're allowed to sort of like deal with that issue is going to only benefit everyone. So, lots for us to think about. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. Hey David, I just saw your thing about recording. You could, I hope did you record? Because you sure could have. I just saw it now. Yeah, no, I would love to be able, if you would send it to me or a link to it, that'd be great. All right, thank you. Thank you so much. And I'll convene. I'm gonna go get a drink and I'll meet you all.